Like Martha Stewart, I have all of my cleaning work done. I've gotten my guys separated, and look, there's the stadium without humans, and you can see the mistakes, they're there. I also added an adjustment layer here to bring back some of the noise that I had cleaned up from the layer before. This is just using a black layer where I've actually applied a noise filter on top of this, and I've kind of shrunk down the noise to be close to what the photographic noise is gonna do. You don't technically have to do this. This is just maintaining the image grain as best as I can for the motion of the shot, where I'm gonna add video grain to this anyway, just to kind of get it moving like a real video. The other way of approaching this is also removing all the grain entirely and then re-adding the grain as well in post. But I kind of like to keep the photographer grain, so that's why I'm sticking with that methodology instead of just eliminating the grain and adding it later. To do that, I'll just kind of quickly show you what the layer looks like here. So I have this on screen, which is just a mathematical application of multiplying and dividing RGB values. So if you're not familiar with how these layer modifications work via Photoshop, that's okay. Just know that this chunk that says lighten, it essentially is trying to lighten data, whereas this is doing some really hard multiplication mathematics, as well as up here in the darken and multiplies. So it just kind of behaves differently. And just so you can see, flip this back to normal, and I up my fill again, so it was at 28. That's actually what my black layer looks like. So you can actually see the noise. You can actually see that the pattern is pretty repetitive. So, you know, in visual effects, we'd change that up a lot more, but. So here's everybody together. Now, if we take away the under guy and the top guy, you notice a little area where I cleaned it up, but I cleaned it up from a darker patch and there's a clear line. This is where we can use our old-fashioned photograph tools. So we have the dodge and burn tool here. Dodging is essentially what you do in the darkroom when you are trying to lighten up an area that's highly exposed, that gets too dark, and you want to bring back the detail in the shadow. Transversely, if you wanted to burn in data that's there, so a good classic example is night photography. If you take a picture of someone standing under a street light and you want to actually catch the detail of the bulb and the lamp and the street light, you would burn into just that portion of the street light. Because silver halide has a ridiculous amount of resolution, you can actually get that detail back only in traditional photography. Unfortunately, with digital photography, if you over or underexpose, it's gone. You've crushed the pixels, so you don't get that data back. So what I'm gonna use the dodge tool. I'm gonna use a super soft brush here. I'm actually adjusting my midtones, and my exposure isn't cranked. I like to do this a little bit at a time because at 25 or higher, it can really sweep across and lighten things a little too fast. Again, I'm on the photo layer, on that midground layer, and you can see, like, if you just have it on a light setting, it really just does quick work of it, and it just helps things blend better. So we've got all of this. I'm gonna go ahead and save this where we're at, right? Again, you can use Control Save as your hotkey. And now I'm actually gonna save as again, but this time I'm gonna get rid of some stuff so we can get this ready for After Effects. So I'm gonna get rid of this contrast brightness thing that I was using to help me isolate things when I was deleting stuff. So I'm gonna get rid of this guy. I'm just gonna hit delete. Yes, I wanna delete it. Delete again. Yes, I wanna delete it. The reason why you have to delete those twice is because when you have a layer mask, it deletes the layer mask first and then it deletes the photo. So you just wanna keep that there. I technically can leave this alone. I can link this with the stadium layer, or I can decide to merge down and you can see what happens. So it's gonna say, do you want to apply or preserve? I actually want to preserve. And again, like if I undo here, you can see that like there's no change there. So usually if you're gonna merge down and you have, and you can read it right there, you know, if this is preserved, then it will mask the merged result, or you can apply it all before merging. I'm gonna preserve it because I do want my alpha channels, obviously, but I don't want this extra layer. It just keeps things neat in After Effects. I am gonna keep my solid just so I can see when I'm making mistakes with my gaps. And then the layout layer, well, we don't need that, so we can get rid of that. It's up to you if you wanna preserve the original for your After Effects version. I'm gonna go ahead and get rid of it because it's just extra layers in my After Effects file. And now I'm gonna save as, which is Shift Control S or Shift Command S on a Mac. Bring this up. I obviously have my p02 AE file there, but I'm gonna make another one here and just call it AE file, and I'm gonna make this version 2. Hit save. And it's saving it as a Photoshop file. And then once you've got to this point, again, you don't have to get rid of all the guys depending on your camera move, but it is possible to replace that stadium. You're pretty much done with Photoshop, so you can close it out. And here we have After Effects already open, and as you notice, it's kind of that same layout as Premiere, as Photoshop. It has all the same things: learning stuff, cloud syncing, creating a new project, opening an existing project. So we're just gonna create a new project. Automatically it throws us into After Effects. So there are 4 key areas to kind of pay attention to. First is your project bin. Much like Premiere, it's up here in After Effects. Quick, fast keys, so you know. We won't really have to mess with interpret footage, but if you need to create a folder, folders are here, or a bin, you know. Creating a new composition is right here, so it's just like that little page turn or the little square with the plus in Premiere. And then of course, if you need to open project settings or adjust project render settings, you have a little quick link right here. And then to delete things, we can delete things right here. Now, I should preface this with the fact that our image, when we downloaded it from the Library of Congress, already came in as an RGB image. I know that for a fact. You can always double check your Photoshop color mode, but if you do this with a CMYK image, you need to convert it before you start taking apart your layers or any of that. Otherwise, you will lose all of your hard work in Photoshop, because After Effects does not work with CMYK objects. So if you're trying to do motion graphics and you're used to Illustrator, Illustrator defaults to CMYK. You have to tell Illustrator you want it to be RGB. It's just a quirk of the system because video is RGB, not CMYK. So that's kind of why there's those 2 main differentiations when you're importing a file that you need to pay attention to. The next part of this bin that's super important is your effects controls. So once you apply an effect to a layer down here in your timeline, all your effects controls go here. So it's kind of like the effects tab in Premiere. They're both next to each other, so it's really great to have them there. The next big thing is your composition viewer window here. You have composition. You also have a way to look just at footage. So your source monitor and your playback monitor are all in the same kind of loop here. You can also look at individual layers, and I'll point out the differences when we import things here. The next thing off to the side here is obviously some of your effects presets. So when you click this, it usually takes most computers a little bit of time to process. And if you have any plugins, the plugins will load. So you have your effects stuff here. So if you know you need levels, you can actually just type in levels and it'll start to bring up your color correction levels here. So that's kind of a fast way to get to effects. It's really nice. You also have your preview playback. I don't usually mess with this. I am not a fan of trying to play things in After Effects. If you don't have a fast computer, you're just gonna bog down your machine by messing with it. So I usually just keep this lower, minimized. Your align, your character, paragraph, that kind of stuff is all for your font. And then of course you have your tracker and content aware fill stuff. This is where all the voodoo magic happens. Down below is your timeline. So this is where all your layers come into. So your layers kind of stack up just like they would in Photoshop. And then you have how long they're in your timeline for. So we're gonna go ahead and import. And the fastest way is either Control I, or I like to right click and just come over here to import file. When you're importing this file, it's going to ask you, what would you like to import as? And a lot of students, somehow they miss this when I do the lecture. You need to import retain layer sizes. If you import as composition, it still will bring in your individual layers in Photoshop. The problem is your anchor point will actually be in the direct center of your composition, not the direct center of your layer. And that's really important when you're animating things and you're moving things. You want the layers to be on the axis that suits the layer, not the axis that suits the composition. And I'll make this really clear when we make our layers 3D, but composition, retain layer sizes. It's not a Photoshop sequence. It's automatically going to create its own composition when we import, so you don't have to click any of these buttons. And it's going to do this and bring you this little layer. And again, it's going to ask you again. So just retain layer sizes. You want to always make sure your layers are editable. You don't want to merge them into footage. Otherwise, you would just import as footage. Hit OK. And it should do two things for you. It'll create your own composition, and it'll put all of your layers nice and neat into a folder. And this is why naming your layers is really important, because this gets convoluted quick. So you want to name those layers. If you double click on your composition, it will load into your timeline. And there you go. There it is from top to bottom. When we want to make these layers 3D, what I usually suggest is just highlighting everything and then clicking this last third option box with the cube. If you don't see this, it's this lower left toggle here. That'll get you those guys. You just click once and instantly it'll make all the layers 3D. Now if you notice, I have 3D handles all over the place instead of smack dab in the middle of my composition. That's exactly what I wanted. That's exactly what retain layer sizes does. I'm gonna undo that square for layer 1 because that's just that blue layer. We don't need that blue layer. Now if I click on the lower player, if we look at where the top part of his foot is and where the bottom of the pedestal is, that's about right. That's about center for as much data stretch as we've got. And you can kind of see the bounding box. It's in the center of that bounding box. If I click the top player, again, his center of gravity is going to be more attuned to what his layer's actually looking like. And that's the importance of importing with retaining layer sizes, is you just get better handles and better positions versus all of them being smack dab in the center. Really saves you some time. So we've got them in, we've got them to be 3D. Now the next thing we have to do is start actually pushing them out in 3D space. Now I was taught a 2-up method, which allows you to see a bird's eye view of your composition on top of seeing your composition. Just so you're aware, we are looking at this in composition mode, right? I talked about this earlier of like, what's the difference between here versus footage? Well, we technically have no footage, no video footage, so that's gonna be blank. And then we have layer. Now if I click on a layer and I come over to layer, it's gonna say nothing. But if I accidentally double click on a layer, then all of a sudden, I'm in layer mode. And a good way to visualize this is if you notice this kind of timeline, this is the only thing that's really different about layer view, is if you can see this big old purple bar and a big old green stripe, that means you're in layer view. You want to be in composition view. So we're gonna push this out into Z depth space. And to get the 2-up look, right here in the center of your viewport, you have this one view. You wanna switch this to 2 views horizontal. And that'll give you your bird's eye view. What I'm gonna do is for this guy, I'm gonna turn off my transparency grid because that gets kind of obnoxious to look at. And that's just right here. That'll turn it black for you. And that's really nice to have because otherwise it gets kind of frustrating to look at. Now, I'm not gonna worry about layer 1. I'm gonna start with my sky background. And you can see that we have a 3D handle. And universally, 3D handles are always the same. Y is always green, X is always red, and Z is always blue. If you notice, my mouse is changing. It has that Z, X, and Y next to it. That lets you know you're manipulating it in 3D space. But I like to just do the top down. That way I know I can grab the Z and not have to worry about it. And I'm just gonna bring this back just a little bit past the black. Now, the more distance you have between things, the less parallax happens. The closer you keep things together, the more parallax happens, just like passing things in the car, right? So I'm gonna move things back into space, all right? I'm gonna put that stadium, almost have it in the middle. Now we have to make a little bit of a choice here. We have our bottom player and our middle ground, and they're essentially on the same plane. So I'm gonna shift select both of those layers. That way I know they're on the same plane. And I mean, he was relatively close to that dude, so I'm gonna keep him there, maybe a little bit closer. I'm gonna leave the top player alone, and I'm gonna go ahead and grab the foreground, and I'm gonna move that forward. Now, because I'm moving this forward, you can see that part of it goes out of the shot and part of it goes below the shot. So I'm actually now gonna look at my comp and I'm just kind of shift and adjust things so that they fit. Now you can see as I move things back into space, they got smaller, so we need to fix those things. We need to scale things back up. I'm not gonna touch my top player because again, he's my kind of neutral, but I am gonna shift select the lower player and the middle ground, and I'm gonna hit S on my keyboard for scale. And because they're both selected, this should both work simultaneously. And really what I'm trying to do is get the edge of this border to be at the edge of the real border. And this is why we kept layer 1 as a non-3D layer, because it just allows us to see our gaps better. In After Effects, to easily change things, let me shift select again here. If you just mouse over the blue letters, you'll get a left-right slider in this hand. Like you can see that it goes from an arrow to being a hand. If you just click and hold and drag to the right, it'll scale up for you. So again, you don't have to go too far past the edge, but you want to make sure that you've hit the edge. And I'm going to do the same thing with the stadium. Highlight the stadium, hit S, and I'm just going to where that stadium touches the shot. You can be on the ball or you can be a little past, doesn't matter. I tend to err on the side of caution and going a little bit past. Now we can also bring the stadium up and kind of try to reframe where we want that grass to be. You can also use your cursor keys or your arrow keys to kind of dial in the shape. And then the sky being the last layer, you can go crazy with this. Now normally I would tell you you shouldn't push things past 125, but this is probably one of the rare few projects you can get away with it, depending on what things are, how bad they distort. But you can see that sky's pretty plain because we cleaned it up that way, so it doesn't really matter. So now we've kind of got everything in 3D space, but nothing's really moving in our composition. Before we really move forward, we're gonna double check to make sure our composition is exactly what we want set up for animation. So there's a couple ways to get to composition settings, either right here under composition settings, or honestly, just learn the hotkey for this because it saves you so much more time just to be able to hit Control or Command K. So here we have our preset. Now this is obviously going to be the preset that the photo is at and not an HD thing, but here's our frame rate. Now our frame rate is in 24 progressive, this is 23.976. I'm actually gonna change this to 24 frames. It's just easier math for animation, and it's the cinematic look. Down here is duration, so this is exactly like time code in Premiere. It's hours, minutes, seconds, frames. You want to make sure that this looks like it says 10 o'clock. That'll give you 10 seconds of animation. And honestly, that's a long shot. Most shots aren't 10 seconds in length, but this will be a good opportunity to kind of see like how long slow-mo can really feel. So the first thing we need to do is we need to add a camera. The easiest way, just right-click down in the timeline, come over to New, and then scroll down to Camera. And the camera will launch its own window. And the most important thing I want you to recognize with the camera is by default, it starts with a 2-node camera. And the only real difference between a 2-node camera and a 1-node camera is that a 2-node camera has a secondary animation control for focal point. We don't want to control depth of field really with this camera because we can just fake depth of field, and the shot itself already has depth of field. Preset wise, it will always go to custom because it is specifically lining up this camera to view what your composition shows edge to edge. If you start changing your lensing preset, it's going to change how this composition is set up, and you might have to tweak your layers to refill the frame or get your camera in a very specific spot to kind of have these lensing properties. With doing this kind of 2.5D effect, you don't ever want to change up the lenses. You can change units, just so you are aware. If you're not savvy with the metric system, you can go back to inches. If you wanted to enable depth of field, it is there. You can technically control all of this. You can technically animate it. A smart person does this at the very end when they're ready to render, because if you enable all of this now, every time you move the camera, your computer's gonna have to reprocess all this data, and I'm not gonna use any of it anyway. So you can see we had a little bit of jump in framing, because again, it's trying to frame up everything. If I zoom out in the top view, you can actually see the field of view of my camera. If we had that 2-node camera, you'd have an extra node right here that you could lock that node to a layer or an object and have this camera swing around it, and you'd get that kind of Michael Bay wraparound. The only problem with this is everything's flat, so it's clearly gonna look like a flat object. I'm gonna get rid of this 2-up because we really don't need it. I tend to animate my camera by hand. You can leave this way if you want to see how far your camera is moving, but I'm really judging it by my composition here. So I'm actually gonna start off just doing maybe like a simple zoom and maybe a little craning down, because you know that's where the motion, these guys are gonna start heading down towards the ground. You always wanna make sure your playhead's at 0 before you start any animation. We are just animating the position data, so P for position with the camera layer selected, and anything with a stopwatch in Adobe means you can animate the property. So I'm going to click once on the stopwatch. That gives me that little blue diamond. There's my little blue diamond. That's your keyframe. And I'm going to come over to the end. And this is where I can move my camera. And again, this is X, Y, Z. So if I wanted to zoom in, I need to come in with my camera. And if I wanted to crane down a little bit, well, that's my Y, right? So I'm gonna come down. Maybe I'll crane up, who knows? Now I tend to test the movement as I drag it back and forth. And maybe I want a little more dramatic. Maybe I'll get rid of the stadium here. I want people to know that it's more than just one move going on. Start a little higher. If I start to see those colors, I can always adjust my layers. It's the nice thing about having that color is you can spot gaps really quickly and then you can fix them. And this is partially what I mean. If I hadn't cleaned up that stadium, you'd be seeing you know, extra versions of this guy. So to prove my point, I'm just gonna duplicate these layers real fast. I'm just hitting Control or Command D, and I'm actually going to make them not 3D. And I'm gonna put them underneath my hero layers. You would get this kind of like, it started out okay, and now I'm moving, oh, I can see the guy's leg. Then you would know what you need to clean up. It was displayed in class, so it's kind of obvious. But that's what I mean. You don't have to clean up everything. You just need to see where overlap isn't happening and just hide what you can see. So you don't have to spend the whole time cleaning the stadium. Ain't nobody got time for that. So you get this, and there's a little bit of parallax going on. It's not super dramatic. He's not really sliding across this stadium. If you wanted that to be a little bit more dramatic, again, the closer things are, the more they slip slide. So there you get even more, just a smidge more sliding across the thing. So it just kind of depends on really how much slippage you want. Sometimes it's nice to gun with the subtle, sometimes you need extreme parallax, so it really just kind of depends on the shot. In order to get this to the right size, so this is one composition already, we're gonna pre-comp this into a proper HD frame. I'm gonna bring this back down to one view. Remember how I said you can use this little button to make a new composition? I'm gonna do just that. Except this time, instead of custom, we're gonna make sure that we have HD TV 1080 24. And you'll know you've got the right one when this says 1920 by 1080. 16 by 9 aspect ratio. Square pixels, 24 frames a second, 10 seconds in duration. This is the time you should name your composition close to what file name that I expect you guys to turn this in. So, you know, if it hasn't been burned into your brain yet, get with the program. So this will be my first version, right? Last name, first initial. Here, I'll click OK, boom. And then there's my AE file comp that I made. I'm just gonna drag and drop this bad boy into the timeline. And now we can actually see how small this is compared to an HD frame. I obviously don't want all this black. So just like your layers, you're gonna hit S for scale. And yes, this means things will get cropped. That's fine. I knew it when I chose this image. It was a medium format image. It was a square. I kind of suspected we would get a little cut off. And depending on my camera move, you might have to change some things. And if you want to change things, that's fine. There's nothing stopping you from going to the players, hitting S for scale, and shrinking them up. You just have to move them because now I've got things revealed, and I've got grass that clearly doesn't belong in that area of the grass. So this is where you just kind of manipulate some things. If this were for a documentary, the goal would be to not be this manipulative with the imagery, but you're learning, so I don't really care. This is a good example to show you, like with this guy's head. In this version, I didn't color in this guy's face, so as this parallaxes, you can kind of see the gap there. That would be something to fix for your final turn-in. You would want to correct that. But there you go, in an HD frame, I got both football players in there. I've got them in with the stadium. You didn't have to extend the shot. Still looks believable. There's a little bit of float there on the grass with him. You can go in and fix that a little bit more, but this is good enough for government work. Most people wouldn't catch that slip slide anyway unless they've had a million times to look at this image to know how it should behave. I showed you the puppet tool in class. There are the advanced stuff, which I haven't had too much time to play with, so you might actually want to hop on to Adobe's YouTube channel and see if they've got a decent tutorial for 2019 or 2020 puppet tool, because they changed it from the original. In my opinion, they really hindered using the puppet tool by adding these different puppet tools that are much more harder to figure out or aren't as intuitive. So you're welcome to bring these guys to life. I try to just think about major animation points, right? Hip, middle of the thigh, knee, middle of the leg, ankle, middle of the foot, toe, and that dot in the middle just adds more stabilization. If you want something to be stiffer, like the torso and the hip, because that portion is more rigid than, say, the leg and this one hand. Like even this hand you could outline entirely with pins, that way they don't move. But you know, maybe the head only needs 1 or 2, so you can get a little movement in the head, 1 or 2 in this hand to get a little movement there. If you made a big circle around the hip with dots, then maybe 1 in the middle of the leg, knee, middle of the calf, ankle. In the toe, you can get things. Same thing with this guy, you'd probably want 1 in the toe, maybe the heel, the ankle, middle of the leg, knee, middle of the thigh. Same thing with this guy, right? If his back is bending, maybe less points along him, so that way you can kind of get that back curling as he's hitting the ground here, right? And less points in the arms, so you can kind of flex and bend those. It's kind of up to you, but just remember that this has to be slow motion to get this in. You can colorize it for extra credit, but I do want a black and white version when you turn this in. So again, you know, you would show me this animation of the black and white version, then you'd show me the animation of the color. You can edit those two together, so it's just one video in Premiere. That'll make my life a little easier. In terms of the creative stuff, I'm leaving that all up to you to take the initiative to learn and figure it out. But that's how you get this in a normal HD size frame. You don't want to be trying to figure out how to get this to render to HD. You want to put it into an HD composition and then render from there. I showed you both ways in class, but I really, for your own sanity's sake, you want to do media encoder. You should get the media encoder to pop up, and just give it a moment. It should load. There it goes. Depending on how fast your machine is, this might take a bit, but it should load in there. I did have to restart just to get this to behave. By default, it comes in as an H.264, which is awesome. If you named your composition file the same as the turn-in rendering name, then you're pretty much ready to rock. Now, if you're doing your camera movement, I'm asking for something that is half HD. If you're doing your final render, you don't have to touch this. You can just go right into it. But if you tap that H.264, you should get this little window for your video source here. And remember, just like in Premiere, you have to come down here, hit this little radial button, make sure that that is selected, and the top one you name to 960. And if you just click away, automatically changes the bottom half to 940. Output name, all right, make sure you know where this is going. This should be going into a render folder. Obviously I have a version 1 in there, so this is gonna be version number 2. Hit save, hit OK, and then you have to hit this little play button here. It'll go through the motions, and again, always, 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 always double check your work. Move that more center so you can see it. right? And there's my movement. So I can test, there's my camera move render. And again, once you've got your camera move render in, go in, animate things. You can get fancier with your camera movement if you really want more drama to the shot. And, you know, get some stuff in there and it should look just fine. And again, always double check your work because that way you can spot any mistakes or errors. If you're on a PC and you're unsure that this rendered to the right size, because I have my VLC to automatically set things up at half size so that way it's not larger than my screen. You can go down, click on properties, click on details, and it'll tell you, yes indeed, it's 960 by 540. On a Mac, you can just hit Command I for information, and in the QuickTime details, it should show you that it is also a half HD video. Good luck, ganbatte, and again, think slow motion, slow motion.